Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Mysteries and Disappearances video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's do another entry here. This one just a random entry that I found within a link that showcases pretty much all the disappearances both before and after a certain time period, in this case 1970. 1970 will just put it at around 50 years plus of someone being gone or being disappeared. It makes it very haunting when you realize all those years that a person has been gone, no trace of them whatsoever, and very little to no clues as to anything ever being found for them. They've just basically disappeared off of the face of the earth. Very, very haunting stuff. Such is the case here with this young woman who was apparently living there in Missoula, Montana. Her last traces were seen there at University of Montana campus, and to this day, again, there's not a single shred of evidence as to what happened to her. Pretty much someone just saw her on her very last day before she disappeared, and then that's it. Nothing else. No other clues, no other indications as to what happened to her. Again, very haunting stuff. But it has to do with this. You're looking at a picture of her now. It's going to deal with the disappearance of Susan Pearson. So let's go ahead and let's talk about all the information associated with this young woman and everything that led to her eventual disappearance. So here's what occurred. What's interesting about Susan Pearson is that this was the daughter and a young woman of someone that came from a prominent family, probably not prominent, like let's say on a nationwide level or probably even statewide level, but at least on the local level, she definitely was known, and her family was known too. She was born in October 1st, 1935, there in Portland, Oregon, and then when she was born, her father was a prominent insurance agent in that location. When you think about it, you know how wherever you live, you'll always see billboards associated with insurance companies and insurance agents, especially those that last a good time period within their locale. They become a member of the community, a pillar of the community, if you will. And so that's essentially what her father was. Her grandfather was actually a senator, a Democratic senator there also in Oregon by a guy by the name of Walter Pearson. So again, it goes to show that she was born and grew up in an eventual, almost influential type family. So her disappearance would essentially rock that location because it basically makes you realize that it can happen to anybody. And so she was there living in that area. I think eventually she moved to Missoula, Montana, and while she was there, she was both working and studying at the University of Montana, working in this case as a part-time instructor, and then studying to complete her thesis, her doctoral thesis, while she was graduating there. I think she was actually going through another university as well, if I'm not mistaken. So working in this case through the University of Montana, and then doing double duty in terms of getting that thesis through another university, University of Oregon. So this was a young woman who was doing everything she could to better herself, to get, this type of stuff in terms of a doctorate, and then also doing it full-time while working part-time as well. So she wasn't someone that was just just doing other things out there that could lead to her disappearance. No, in this case, she was doing everything that seemed perfectly right, perfectly fine. But here's what happened eventually on that fateful night. So sometime on March 13th, 1966, while she was there on that same campus, she was last seen by some friends there. In fact, on that day, she was scheduled to also meet some of her students because she was going to administer a business exam to one of her classes. But lo and behold, she was never there. In other words, the students were there. They were there ready to take the exam, but she never showed up. And then cut to a couple of days later, and still nobody finding her altogether. That's when it was reported that she was missing. In fact, the last person to have seen her among her friends was another woman. Interesting enough, she had the same name, first name, Susan King. She was someone that was a friend of Susan Pearson, and she later told law enforcement that Susan had visited her just the previous night on March 12th, but that oddly enough, she seemed out of place. Like it was almost like she was nervous, she was depressed, and she was in some hyper agitated state. I'm guessing that the friend, though, thought to herself, this could just be nervous Nellies, like stuff associated with either her thesis that she was again completing there at that University of Oregon, or maybe she had some other other stuff going on in her life and her job, her part-time work causing stress, that kind of stuff. It was a little alarming, but the impression I got was that it wasn't something emergency-wise. Like, in other words, her friend wasn't calling law enforcement or anything like that to try to get attention as to what was occurring. It just made it seem like it just stood out, but nothing really severe in that case. So her friends saw her on that fateful day, March 12th, pretty much the last person to do so. Other people saw her the next day of March 13th, and then that was it. That was the last time anyone had ever seen her walking around that campus. After March 13th, she was no longer seen at that location. And then, of course, she was then reported missing a couple of days later. If I'm not mistaken, it was on March 18th afterward. The reason why she was reported missing was because her vehicle was actually found abandoned at an area there in Missoula that's called the business district. Every town has those districts. There'll always be somewhere like in the middle or the center of downtown areas. That's where there's usually larger office buildings, larger financial buildings, or other type of government buildings as well. Well, her car was found pretty much abandoned there, and in it there was her purse. Her car keys were also left within the car. I mean, who does that, right? Who leaves actual car keys within the car itself? And then her IDs were found there too. On top of that, also, whenever there was, since she was working at part-time at the University of Montana, whenever it came time for her checks to be issued for the previous week's work that she had done, they totaled about $1,200, but nobody ever came to claim them. They were just left there as is, again, indicating that she had gone. Something had happened to her. She had disappeared. Otherwise, somebody would have, even if they, let's say, knew about her whereabouts, or in turn were doing something nefarious and still trying to collect money on her behalf, they would have shown up, but nobody ever did. They were absolutely just left unclaimed. And so that's when the investigation started to see what happened to Susan Pearson. People were looking around, trying to figure out. The last person, again, that saw her had seen her wearing these slacks, a green coat, and then with some plaid lining, and she also has some diamond rings on her. But anyone that was sharing these pictures and trying to find out essentially what happened to her, nobody had a clue. Nobody had a single idea. Of course, one of the first areas that the police and law enforcement looked at was her apartment. But again, in another mystifying turn, nothing was left there in terms of clues. It was actually undisturbed, is the way the wording was used. It was almost as if she had just walked out of that apartment as a regular person would within their apartment on any normal day, and then just never came back. Her brother, David Pearson, stated that he thinks that she actually left more in a hurry, because afterward there was some examinations, and apparently a tea kettle there was left on, boiling on the stove, but it was never turned off. And then also a porch light, which she always left on in the evenings, was never turned off either. So that gave some indication that whatever was happening with his sister, something was occurring to her to leave a little bit more earlier, or a little bit more in an emergency mode than usual. Those two factors just added more to it. Again, and I mentioned a couple of minutes ago too, her being nervous and depressed and showing those indications to her other friend Susan just made things again more mysterious as to why all of a sudden she wanted to leave. One thing that was a different twist or a different turn of sorts was that her friend did state that at one point Susan told her that she just wanted to leave. Like, she just wanted to leave and start a whole new life. Who knew why she exactly said that? My guess is that there was, again, a lot of things probably happening within her life, not just with that thesis, because that's a lot of work in of itself, but everything else in terms of probably the prominence within her family, like her family legend and everything, all the pressure being built to her to become someone important. For her to say something like that makes one realize that this young woman, Susan, probably was like, I'm not sure if I could handle this type of stuff. I just want to create my own identity, just start over from scratch. That's at least the impression that I got. when it came to that. And who knows, that could lead to further theories, because a lot of times people that disappear sometimes voluntarily disappear. They just leave and truly do start someplace elsewhere on their own. But in this case, no, it seems like something else more nefarious happened. But police stated there was no indication of foul play, no indication of anything bad happening to her by other people. Closest thing was this. Apparently, in one of the courses that Susan was teaching there at the university, there was at least one or two young males, young boys in other words, who got poor grades from her, and they had stated that they were going to teach her a lesson, like they were going to threaten to wreck her car, was the only indication given. But police investigated that claim, and they looked around certain areas, and I'm sure they probably interviewed those young men, but they found no evidence that there was any wrongdoings done, and so that avenue wasn't pursued afterward. There was an area, though, later on, I think it was the next year on March 31st, where someone claimed to have seen Susan at an area that's called Lolo Pass. So those of you that maybe are in that area there again in Montana, Missoula, Montana, might know more information about Lolo Pass, but that's apparently one other person stated that's where they saw her as well. The family, of course, never gave up. Later on, they hired a private detective, somebody who used to work in the FBI, to try to find her whereabouts, but nothing was ever found. Eventually, a couple of years later in the 70s, there was an arm and a hand that was found also in an area there called the Blue Mountain region, and in it was examined thinking that this could finally be the whereabouts of Susan Pearson, but no. It was reported that these were actually animal bones. This was something belonging to a bear rather than a person. And yet another different circumstance, a couple of years later, there were some more bones found, and it was thought that these were fingers that could be tied to a person and maybe even Susan herself. But these fingers were thought to actually have been only about 4 or 5 years old at the time, not necessarily the time period that Susan went missing. So that was abandoned as well. But that's pretty much it. Again, on that fateful day, pretty much on March 13th, 1966, that was the last time she was seen walking around that campus. Her friends seeing her the day before, and then that was it. She was gone. Nobody ever saw her. No one knew how. Her car was abandoned within that business district, and there's no indication of anything as to her whereabouts. Again, truly haunting stuff, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video. But if anybody has any more information, anything else I might have missed, then please post those comments below. Anybody there from that area there in Missoula? If so, then maybe and you know more information, or at least on a personal level, as to what occurred, the hoopla and all the hype associated with this disappearance with that prominent family, you just know that they would never have given up and they would have continued for the longest time. So if someone has more personal information on that, and that'd be really great to share, considering in this case that this is now 50 plus years old and she was age 30 at that time. There's still a chance, who knows, that somewhere Susan could still be alive if she truly left on her own to just start her whole life over. So there's always that possibility, but who knows, we might get a final answer on that sometime soon. All right, everyone, thanks again as always. Take care.